Hold on. I like that. All right. How you doing? My name is Jason, and I'm going to be reading Matthew 6, chapters 5 and 6. When you pray, don't be like the hypocrites who love to pray publicly on street corners and in synagogues where everyone can see them. I tell you the truth, that is all the reward they will ever get. But when you pray, go away by yourself, shut the door behind you, and pray to the Father in private. Then your Father who sees everything will reward you. Amen.
Thank you, Jason. And good morning. It has been a long time since I've been invited to speak up here. And some of you might even be new to the church, so I feel like I should introduce myself. My name is Craig Uplinger, and my introduction is short. My life's work is in education, a teacher. And so I thank Vince and Lorraine for sharing this space with me, inviting me to do so, and making this my classroom today. And I consider it a privilege for you to be my students today, and I hope I can offer you something. I want to start by referring back to a series that Vince taught last month, December, The Waiting. The Waiting, that was the name of it, right? And in the course of many important things he talked about the importance of the personal narratives we tell ourselves as we wait. And he also shared a song, the lyrics of the songs, not the one you sang, but the lyrics of a John Mayer song, Waiting on the World to Change. So let's start by asking you, by show of hands, how many of you are desperately waiting for the world to become more kind and decent and just? For those watching, that's near unanimous. Me too. And while I wait, sometimes I lose faith, and my narrative grows very dark. And as Vincent taught, that is not the kind of narrative that gives birth to miracles. So really, this talk today, this lesson today, began as sort of a personal meditation on the narratives I tell myself while I wait. But it has evolved into a lesson that is deeply rooted into our history. And I want to share it with you, and hopefully you can find some spiritual application. But I'm going to need your help. I'm going to need your imagination. And I want you first to imagine two doors, one at the top of the steps here, and one at the top of the steps there. And as I walk through those doors up onto the stage behind me, I'm going to be asking you to imagine extraordinary events that happen in our history. But then when I walk back through those doors down here, I want you to imagine more quiet, intimate, ordinary places that are also part of our history. So, if you're ready, let's imagine Montgomery, Alabama, December 1955. A seamstress leaves a Montgomery department store at 5 o'clock after her shift. She boards this bus, the Cleveland Avenue City bus, and there were rules for sitting on that bus. You see, the first 10 seats of the bus were reserved for white passengers. The back 10 seats of the bus were reserved for black passengers. And the middle of the bus, they informally called it no man's land, meaning black passengers could sit there, but they had to vacate if requested by a white passenger or the bus driver. And on that night, the seamstress sat in the first section of the middle 16 seats, the first section of no man's land. Now, the bus, when she got on, was nearly empty, but after a few stops, it started to fill up until the bus driver turned around and came back to the seamstress and said, "Come on now, you got to give me that seat." And Rosa Parks said, "I got on first. I paid the same fare. I don't think I should have to move." And she looked out the window. And the bus driver turned and he contacted the police. And the police came and very quickly arrested Rosa Parks. And then they took her down to the police station where a man named E.D. Nixon, the president of the local chapter of the NAACP, paid her bail. And he knew Miss Parks because she served as secretary in that chapter. And he spoke with her that night and he said, "Are you willing to be the face of a citywide boycott?" And she agreed. And Nixon was excited, E.D. Nixon was excited. And the next day he went and he spoke to the local black leaders of Montgomery. And it was quickly decided, we'll do a one-day citywide boycott on December 5th. And then at 7 p.m. we'll have a community meeting at the Holt Street Baptist Church. It was decided. After a weekend of chaotic planning and organization, Monday morning came. And black citizens of Montgomery shared taxis and shared rides and walked long distances, and nearly empty bus after nearly empty bus went by. It was a complete success. And Nixon and the other leaders got together in the basement of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church at about 3 o'clock on the 5th. And it was pretty quickly decided we are going to continue this bus boycott. But then the pastors and ministers of the local black churches said, hey, do we have to publish our names? And E.D. Nixon, up at the front of the room, confronted them. And he said, now how are you going to do a citywide boycott and not have white folk know that you are involved? You have got to stop hiding behind the skirts of courageous women. You have got to stop being cowards. And from the back of the room, a 26-year-old late arriving pastor spoke up and said, I am not a coward, Mr. Nixon. I don't want anyone to call me a coward. And it was the voice of Martin Luther King Jr. And he was quickly escorted up to the front of the room, and he was invited to speak. And very quickly it was decided 3 things. The bus boycott would go forward, all names would be published, and the youngest man in the room, Martin Luther King Jr., would be the president of the Montgomery Improvement Association. And the Montgomery Improvement Association would lead, orchestrate, oversee the entire boycott. And oh yeah, just one more thing, Mr. King. As president of the Montgomery Improvement Association, you will be the featured speaker at our 7 o'clock community meeting at Holt Street Baptist Church. And then they ended their meeting after 6 o'clock. Martin Luther King rushed home. That's his home, still today. He sees his wife, Coretta, in the kitchen, and she's making dinner, and she's caring for their 17-day-old daughter, Yolanda. And she says, Martin, do you want something to eat? And he says, no, I have neither time nor appetite. And then he told her about his new responsibilities and said, what do you think? And she says, you know, I will back you in whatever you do. Martin thanked Coretta, and then he walked into his study and closed the door behind him. And he understood, I have 20 minutes before my ride arrives. And he later recounted that he wasted the first 5 minutes in a state of anxiety, panicked. And then he spent the next 5 minutes praying the panic away. And it calmed his mind. And with the final 10 minutes, he jotted down some notes that he would say that night. And his ride was on time, so he walked back out of his study, kissed Coretta goodbye, kissed Yolanda goodbye, and back out he went. He got in the car, but as they got close to the Holt Street Baptist Church, cars were everywhere. Traffic stopped his car. And people were lining the sidewalks, walking to the church, and King said, I have to do the same. And as he got close to the church, he saw people on ladders putting speakers up on the outside of the church for the thousands of people that could not fit inside the church. A newspaper account the next day estimated over 5,000 people attended the community meeting. And Dr. King clearly understood this was his audience. That's the Holt Street Baptist Church on the inside. King stepped to the podium at 7:30, and he later said that he understood his responsibility was to balance the militant and the moderate. He had to give them the courage to be militant enough to act, but moderate their emotions so they would never act with violence. And he fulfilled his purpose with words like, we are here tonight because of our love of democracy, because of our deep-seated belief that democracy, turned from thin paper into thick action, is the greatest form of government on the face of the earth. And cheers rise. And then after sharing some details about the treatment of Miss Parks and her arrest, he heard some angry murmurs, and he said, we are tired now. But we will not advocate violence. No, no. We are a Christian people. We follow the teachings of Jesus Christ. The only weapon we have in our hands tonight is the weapon of protest. And cheers rise again. And then at the apex of his speech, Dr. King says, and we are not wrong in what we're doing. If we're wrong, the Supreme Court of this country is wrong. If we're wrong, the Constitution of the United States is wrong. If we're wrong, God Almighty is wrong. If we're wrong, Jesus was merely a utopian dreamer. If we're wrong, justice is a lie. Love has no meaning. And we are going to fight and work until justice falls down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. And the shouts came after every line, and a deafening cheer exploded within the church. And a reporter later said, as it died down in the church, he could hear it continuing outside on the lawns and in the adjacent streets. It was a miraculous beginning to what became a year-long boycott of Montgomery City buses. And King became a national figure. But there was hardship, rocks through windows, injuries, a bomb, ultimately 2 deaths. But in June of 1956, a federal district court ruled that segregation laws on Alabama buses was unconstitutional. And in November of 1956, the Supreme Court upheld that ruling. And on December 20th, 1956, black citizens of Montgomery could pay their fare, and if they got on first, they could sit anywhere they wanted. I wonder sometimes about our history. I'm glad that we appropriately celebrate events like you just imagined. It is appropriate to celebrate Rosa Parks and the Montgomery City bus boycott and King as an extraordinary man. But I have a question for you. What if we only celebrate that? What if we don't celebrate or even recognize King's ordinary moment when he went into a study and panicked? my question here is this. If we only celebrate the extraordinary events, and King is a one-of-a-kind, extraordinary leader, are all of us ordinary people missing something in the lesson? So I'm going to see if we can get a little bit closer to an answer by sharing just one more extraordinary event in our history. But before I do, and before we walk through that door, I wanted to share a little background. Between November 1961 and November of 1961, the fall of 1962, Dr. King led a nonviolence campaign in Albany, Georgia. Thousands were arrested. Hundreds were injured. And the result? No new law, no favorable court decisions. King himself later said, "Our protests were so vague that we got nothing, leaving people depressed and in despair." And many were beginning to see King as a relic of the 1950s. His time was past. He was a reluctant and losing crusader. And you know what? King's inaction reinforced that view, because for 8 months after Albany, he was out of the public eye. That was until he received an invitation from a man named Fred Shuttlesworth, a pastor in Birmingham, Alabama, April 1963. And though invited, King was not welcome, even by those he considered his allies, local business leaders, local clergy. Because they said, you know what, we are negotiating with newly elected moderate leaders in the city council. If you come in as an outsider with your nonviolent campaign, you're going to create tension. And we have no possibility of progress then. But King nevertheless started his Birmingham campaign in the first week of April, 1963. Lunch counter sit-ins. Many were arrested. Jail cells started to fill up. And within 1 week, King's organization ran out of money to pay for the bail. Birmingham passed an injunction to forbid further protests. The local Alabama courts upheld the injunctions. Protests ground to a halt. It was Albany all over again. On Good Friday morning, April 12th, King and his closest advisors met in a suite of the Gaston Motel. King had a bedroom off to the side. And in the suite, the advisors were discussing, what do we do next? And they started debating. We have to end this campaign. It's a failure. We can end this campaign. Everybody will see it as a failure. I know, but we're out of money. And how are we going to raise more money? King can't raise more money here. He's got to leave. He can't leave. If he leaves, people will see him as abandoning Birmingham. It will be a failure. Okay, fine. Okay, if he stays, then I don't know. He's got to do something drastic. Maybe Dr. King has to go into jail. And Dr. King sat silently through this debate, watching it go back and forth and around. And then without a single word, he stood up, walked through a door, and shut it behind him. And he later said, "I stood in the middle of the room and I could feel the events of my life surrounding me. And I could see all the black people in Birmingham surrounding me, waiting." And he closed his eyes. And suddenly, a vision leaped to his mind. And he said, that vision took me past the Gaston Motel. It took me past Birmingham and the city jails. It took me past the country to a vision of 20 million black people crossing the Red Sea of injustice. And he concluded, there can be no doubt. He changed into blue jeans and a gray cotton shirt, and he re-entered the room and was greeted with silence. They had never seen Dr. King look like this. It was always a suit and a tie. And King broke the silence by saying, well, I don't know what's going to happen. And I don't know where we're going to get the money. But I do know that I must do a faith act. I'm going to march even if I have to march alone. And he marched. But he wasn't alone for long, because the New York Times reported that spontaneously around him grew a crowd that was as big as 1,000 people singing in celebration. But then King came before the police, and he quietly kneeled, and he put his hands behind his head, and they cuffed him, and then they pulled him up by his belt, and then they unceremoniously grabbed him by the arm and threw him into the back of a paddy wagon. And when he got down to the station, they said, throw him into solitary confinement. And once again, King walked through a door where he passed from an extraordinary man orchestrating extraordinary events to the most common of men in a jail cell. April 13th, the next day, a man named Clarence Jones visited King in that cell. He brought with him a copy of the Birmingham News. Now, on page 2 of the news, there was a picture. And the picture was of King being arrested. And below the picture was an article, and the title of the article was, "White Clergy Urge Local Negroes to Abandon Demonstrations." And King started to read the article, and he said, I know these clergies. They're allies. He was hurt. And after Jones left, he took the paper and he started writing his thoughts down in the margins, in every open area he could find. And when Jones next visited on Tuesday, April 16, King, to keep it away from the eyes of those he didn't want to see, hid it in his shirt and then handed it to Jones through the bars. And he explained to Jones, hey, you've got to follow the arrows. Like if you follow it this way in the symbols, then you can determine the sequence of what I wrote, okay? Okay, do we share that? And so Jones took it. And then King said, do you have another paper? Do you have any paper? Do you have a sandwich wrapper? And Jones gave him what he could. And this exchange happened every 2 or 3 days until King was released. And then what was given was then taken to a woman named Willie Pearl Mackey King. And she transcribed it all. She said it was like putting a jigsaw puzzle together. That jigsaw puzzle became Letter from Birmingham Jail, one of the most important documents in our nation's history. You want evidence? I taught a course called We the People, the Citizen of the Constitution, and in the appendix of that textbook, there were 4 documents: Virginia Declaration of Natural Rights, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution of the United States, and Letter from Birmingham Jail. I mean, directly, it was a letter written to the clergy in the article. But indirectly, it is an instruction manual for citizenship. More directly, why ordinary and even disenfranchised citizens must resist injustice. And then, how to do it. I'm going to share just 4 things from the letter of Birmingham Jail, that talks to that. First, King talks about the centrality and necessity of tension. He says, I am not afraid of the word tension. We merely bring to the surface the hidden tension that is already alive. We bring it out in the open, where it can be seen and dealt with. Like a boil on a body that must be opened with all its ugliness to the natural medicines of light and air, injustice must be exposed with all its tension to the light of human conscience in the air of national opinion, if it can be cured. He talked about how to respond to just and unjust laws. He defined what that was, but then he talked about how to respond to it. He says one has a legal and moral responsibility to obey a just law. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey an unjust law. We should never forget that everything Adolf Hitler did in Germany was legal. And every action taken to give aid or comfort to a Jew in Hitler's Germany was illegal. Then he talked about the relationship between civil protest and human conscience. One who breaks an unjust law must do so openly, lovingly, and with a willingness to accept the penalty. I submit that an individual who breaks a law that conscience tells them is unjust and who willingly accepts the penalty of imprisonment in order to arouse the conscience of the community is in fact expressing the highest respect for law. And extremism? King says, I've gained satisfaction from being called a radical, an extremist. Was not Jesus an extremist for love? Was not Amos an extremist for justice? Was not Paul an extremist for the gospel? So the question is not whether we'll be extremists, but what kind of extremists we will be. Will we be extremists for hate, or will we be extremists for love? At the end of his letter, his tone is almost apologetic as he's addressing directly the clergy in the article. And he says, never before have I written so long a letter. I can assure you it would have been much shorter if I had been writing from a comfortable desk. But what else can one do when he is alone in a narrow jail cell other than write long letters, think long thoughts, and pray long prayers? King was released from jail in late April. The Birmingham campaign suddenly had renewed energy. But local officials had renewed commitment to meet that energy with violence. Billy clubs, fire hoses, even on children and dogs. Birmingham became front page news across the country, across the globe. Pressure mounted and negotiations resumed, and on May 10th, an agreement was reached to begin integration of Birmingham, previously called America's most segregated city. But tragically, for months after that agreement, violence occurred. King would next return to Birmingham on September 18th to eulogize 4 little girls who were killed on a Sunday morning in a church by a bomb. The fight for justice continues. And it continues still, 60 years later. So as I conclude, I want to harken back to as I began my lesson. I began by asking you to imagine 2 doors that acted as passageways from ordinary spaces to extraordinary events and back again. And in the middle of my talk, I asked a question. If we only celebrate what we imagined up here, the extraordinary events, and if we only celebrate king as an extraordinary, one-of-a-kind leader? Are we ordinary people missing something in the lesson? I hope your imagination and my words help you come to an answer. But I will share my answer. There would not have been that without this. There would not have been the extraordinary events that we celebrate without King's ordinary moments. When he walked into a door or walked through a door and panicked. When he was afraid and anxious, vulnerable and confused, insecure and alone. Because, as I see it, in those moments, in those rooms, King was rewarded with miraculous words to say. Even in that jail cell, he was rewarded with the courage to do a faith act. Matthew 6:6 reads, "When you pray, go away by yourself, shut the door behind you, and pray to your Father in private. Then your Father, who sees everything, will reward you." Tomorrow, our nation will celebrate Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And appropriately, you will see much about the extraordinary events, and you will hear about how he is an extraordinary man, and he is. But I hope you take some time to remember him in his most vulnerable moments, because that's when he's most like us. See, I struggle to identify with a man that could stand in front of 250,000 people in Washington and say, "I have a dream." I mean, this is a struggle for me. I like learning that he sometimes was like us. And if you recognize that, then you also recognize that Matthew 6:6 is offered to us too, equally to him. We have the opportunity to walk away from the chaos and the noise and the ugliness of this world, to shut the door behind us, and please leave your phone outside. We have the opportunity to be alone with our conscience and our soul and our God. We ordinary people can be fully in the presence of an extraordinary God. And we too can ask, "God, please reward me with some wisdom while I wait. Please give me the courage to do a faith act." Because maybe if we start doing that a little more often, rather than posting the next thing or reading the next post or clicking the channel to a news, maybe if we do that, we can change the narratives we tell ourselves while we wait for this world to change. Just maybe that narrative, that new narrative that is more positive, can be the kind of narrative that can give birth to some small miracle of justice that we bring into this world. You don't have to be Dr. King. You just have to be in the presence of an extraordinary God. So, that's my answer. I hope you find yours. But as I invite the worship team, the choir, to come back up and sing one more song, I want to share a little anecdote about the song they're going to sing. King did almost all of his work in the South. And it wasn't until 1965 that he ventured into the North. And he was disturbed by what he saw because he didn't expect the prejudice to be quite so intense. And he was in Chicago in July of 1965. And you can see it on a video. He's standing before a podium. And all around him are individuals in that church. And he looks so tense. Like he just looks so tense. Like walls are up around him. And over to the left is Mahalia Jackson. And she's reading him. And she goes, oh, he's not in a good place. So what does she do? Well, she's Mahalia Jackson. She starts singing the Battle of Jericho. And soon, like, the whole church is singing with her. In fact, the only person in the church not singing is Dr. King. But he's smiling, and his shoulders are a little bit more relaxed, and he even starts to move a little bit, which for him was a lot. So we're going to finish with the Battle of Jericho.
Please stand with us.